Welcome everyone. I am acting as a sort of satellite today on behalf of the Myers, I don't know, network, which is interested in road mapping. This is a very European activity, road mapping the future of music information research. The R, of course, in MIR is ambiguous. It could be music information research, it could be music information retrieval, we all know that. And our panellists, I guess, at least some of them are going to be addressing that distinction. What I've done for this panel is to invite some very eminent and esteemed colleagues who I think have relatively little standard overlap with the CMMR conference. So it's quite deliberately an attempt to bring in some different perspectives, some new thought maybe into this area, and perhaps a little bit of controversy as well, I certainly hope so. The form of this panel will be short opening statements of up to 10 minutes from each of our four speakers. Then they will cross-examine themselves for some period, again up to about 10 minutes. I'm guessing they will have things to ask each other. And then we'll open it to the floor so that you can ask them questions also. I should warn you that when I mentioned this to one of my colleagues here, he asked, can I cross-examine them too? And I said yes. So if you ask a question, you may have to take the consequences. So I will introduce my colleagues one by one as they come in to speak. We're doing it in alphabetical order of surname for no particular reason, but just seems sensible. And our first speaker is Professor Joydeep Bhattacharya, who is a psychologist and signal processing specialist from Goldsmiths, University of London. John.
Well, thank you, Geraint, and also thanks for the kind invitation. I mean, Geraint, when he proposed this, the idea of the panel, then just to somehow stir up this field, then I realized that, well, I don't have much experience in terms of music information retrieval, as Geraint already mentioned. But we do a little bit of research on the music, and also we're primarily interested also in the brain, how the music is processed in the brain, both from neuroscience perspective as well as from psychology perspective. So I would share some of my own concerns or some of the topics that I find personally relevant, so which may or may not be important to you at this point, but I believe that some of the things should have been investigated in future in closer detail in order to have a better understanding, both from neuroscience perspective as well as from computational perspective that you are undertaking. And since this, the theme of this conference is about emotion, so I choose very specific music-induced emotion. So music and emotions, interestingly, John is a very distinguished music psychologist. He wrote long back that the majority or the principal reason of why we invest so much of our resources after music is primarily in the emotion, or to get the pleasure out of it. But in the research-wise, it is rather quite a new endeavor. So 20 years back, not many papers in empirical research was done on the music and emotion, absolutely nothing from the brain perspective. But in 2001, there was a handbook published, and not surprisingly, both editors are present in this auditorium. One is John, and this is Patrick, who was a keynote speaker. They came up with a very nice book, Music and Emotion, possibly everyone, most of you are familiar with it, or maybe not. It was approximately 500 pages long. So it is, I would say, quite an interesting, I would say, decent volume size-wise, even for a new field. And if you forward the wheel 10 years, in 2011, this is a young field, and now they have updated the handbook. It is now 1,000 pages. So it tells one thing quite convincingly that this field has taken up by the researchers across several disciplines. So naturally, when any research topic becomes quite popular, comes at the forefront, then there are a lot of issues okay, to be resolved because different groups are using different paradigms. And here I would highlight some of the things that one should be careful or while interpreting the results, especially while talking about music-induced emotions. So some of the ongoing debates or the issues that I personally find it interesting and also I think relevant to the field. The first is, I'll just give you a very, very brief, very surface level description. The first is the distinction or the question whether the music-induced mood and music-induced emotion are the same or the different. If you look into the literature a few years back, researchers used interchangeably. But mood and emotion, as we know from the neuroscience perspective and from the psychological perspective, they are not the same thing. The mood operates on a much longer lasting scale. It has a much spread of attention, but emotion is much short-lived. It has a much narrower focus of attention. But we, the researchers, we are somewhat to some extent guilty that we use often, you will find in the literature, we use these terms interchangeably, although neurophysiologically and cognitively, they are not the same. The second, there's a big debate going on, primarily started by the philosophers, but then later on picked up by the neuroscientists or psychologists there, whether the musical emotions are the real emotions or not. You know, possibly there's debate, there's emotivist and cognitivist. There, one group says, no, it only can express emotions, it doesn't induce. Other group says, not really, there is substantial evidence provided primarily by the neuroscientific studies where it shows that the music or listen to music, core brain regions are activated, those similar brain regions which are activated during other emotional processing. So it somehow suggests that possibly the musical emotions are indeed real, they are not illusory. The third point, which is again quite an important point, but often interchangeably used, the perceived and felt emotions are the same or the different. When you play music to your participant or to your volunteers, okay, there are two kinds of processing going on. The participants, they recognize what is the emotion conveyed by the music, and there's another emotions that the participants feel or induced by the music. Are these two the same? Definitely not. But again, interestingly, till a few years back, these two terms are used interchangeably, more so in the performance research. So one has to be quite careful to distinguish these terms before interpreting the results. So are musical emotions similar to other emotions? Fundamental questions. Okay, some groups say possibly not, because music conveys a very complex, broad spectrum of emotions. There are a lot of complex emotions like joy, tenderness, wonder. Okay, all these emotions you do not find, okay, or similar kind of emotional experience you not experience while, suppose, watching a movie or suppose while reading a poem. So there are some kind of possibly dissimilarities or some kind of speciality there in the musical emotions, but other groups says possibly not. Is it just you're using some kind of semantical levels, okay? But essentially, or on the neural level, they are represented by the similar brain processes. The next question, what are the best models of musical emotions there? I was present in the last couple of talks. I found that there is a predominant use, at least for the last couple of talks, this dimensional model, arousal and valence, which is a very powerful model. If you study the psychological literature, you'll find there's another powerful model that is the categorical or the discrete dimensional models. And now in the more recent times, there has been I would say, stronger voice claiming that the musical emotions cannot be adequately expressed by this simple model. So it needs something more special. The Swiss group, they came up with a 43-dimensional model. Okay, and if you want to do neuroimaging, they have a 9-dimensional shorter versions. So the question is, there the different possibilities are there, and we still do not know how these models map into each other or which model to choose, which one is the most appropriate. Other one, philosophical questions. Now, the experience out of musical emotions, are they the same experience when, suppose, you appreciate or when you have an experience, a very strong aesthetic experience while reading a beautiful poem or visiting an art gallery or not? So this musical aesthetics, aesthetical experience out of music, are these the same aesthetical experience out of other arts? It's an ongoing debate, there is no clear answer, but most likely not. Just I'll give you one clue that I feel important, because evolutionary, till I would say, bearing the last 150 years, before recording device, music could only be enjoyed in the presence of the performer. But while you can watch, you can appreciate a cave art or other arts because they are static, you do not need the performers to be present. So there is a strong and evolutionary need of coupling between the performers and the listeners in the music, although these days, after the advent of recording system, we tend to ignore that fact. But in terms of evolution, music could not be appreciated in the absence of performer, but static art could be. There are a lot of other contextual factors or sociological factors of the role of expertise. So whether the musicians, whether their musical experience or musical emotions are the same as emotional experience for the non-musicians. Possibly not, because in terms of the behavioral result-wise, there is not much of difference. Neurally, there are some subtle differences, but still we're scratching the surface. Gender differences, cross-cultural aspect, we could be familiar to, say, suppose when you do an experiment, we could be familiar to the music, but we might not be familiar, say, suppose, also the association between familiar to a musical style and familiarity to a specific piece. That important distinction has not been adequately investigated. And also the social context. The same piece of music could elicit different emotional experience depending on the social context. There has been a classic social psychological study that's been done. Brilliant concert violinist. If you listen to him in the tube station, you don't pay any attention, but you are willing to pay hundreds of pounds to attend to their concert. So in social context, the intention, that's a very important role. And that has quite a strong correlate in the neuroscience as well. It has been found that when we anticipate a big reward, then our prefrontal cortex, that's the reward circuitry that get activated. And all this, usually you'll see most of the studies, bearing these, they are primarily rely on the self-reports of emotions. Means experimenter, play some music and you ask the person, what do you think? Is it happy or sad? What do you think? We are relying on the verbal report. And I personally feel that you only get, a kind of a convoluted response. And those convoluted response might not always give you the true emotional experiences. I'll just give a quote which was actually cited in the 10-year back old handbook by Isabella Perez, a distinguished researcher on the music psychology, where she wrote, musical emotions typically occur without consciousness or willingness. Musical emotions can be recognized without being experienced. And to bypass this problem, one can take different routes, and these include brain-related measurements and indirect measures. There is an obvious need to go beyond conventional means of studying emotions. Direct measure is you ask a subjective report. Indirect measures is you're recording brain signals which is not directly under your control, or you come up with other kind of, I would say, clever paradigm where you are getting, or you get a kind of handle on the emotional experience, not based on the subjective report, but through other way. And the one interesting way, actually, this is called the priming paradigm. Social psychologists know this for many years. They use this is priming paradigm is primarily they use certain priming stimuli, and then they look for the effect of the priming stimuli on a target domain there. Based on the assumptions that the priming stimuli, the evaluations of the prime that will influence how you process the target. And what has been found, although this is a kind of rather new domain, using music as a priming stimuli there, and what has been found so far, that the music-induced emotions, they modulate different other types of tasks, like visual emotional processing, so that there is a cross-modal transfer of musical valence from the music domain to, suppose, the face, or also cross-modal transfer of arousal from the music domain to, suppose, more of a complex picture. Even the background music or the emotions within the background music, however short, that could influence your low-level visual processing, in which is inconsistent with the metaphor-consistent mapping. So all this shows that although the experimenter are not asking the participants explicitly what do they think about the music, but their experience, which are predominantly unconscious, okay, that somehow influence the processing. Influence the processing of other tasks which is going on simultaneously. So that somehow tells also some characteristics of the musical emotion or the emotional experience out of music. Very briefly, okay, I mean this is Patrick is here. Okay, so sorry about the color choice. I don't know why it's changed like that. It's not important here because Patrick, I'm sure he talked in more detail about a lot of different possible ways in emotions could be induced. So the last one, which is the musical expectancy, which is not a new concept, proposed in 1950s, even earlier. There are emotions we experience out of emotions by whether our expectation is fulfilled or violated. And there I think could be, okay, I mean here there could be more of a significant contribution could come from the engineers and others, because here how to quantify the musical expectancy. So there's one, I would say, this first validation of this theoretical proposition came from one of the papers by Stefan Kolsch, which is a quite well-known researcher in neuroscience of music. He showed that if you presented a chord progression, the last chord, if it is an irregular chord, that activated amygdala. Amygdala, if you're not familiar with it, it is a deep structure in the brain, in the paralimbic region, which is essentially involved with the primarily negative emotional processings. And we did some research with Geraint and others with the help of the model, because they have a model where one could quantify the information content of individual note. And when we contrast between notes which have a high information as compared to which has a low information, high information means they are rather unexpected, and then we found there's activation in the rostral part of the anterior cingulate cortex that also involved in the emotional conflict monitoring. So this is a very early evidence that the emotional regions of the brain are tapped by the violations of the musical expectancies. There's a last slide, possibly Geraint missed it, doesn't matter. So there I just listed some other open questions where we think that what we could also learn from you at the same time. Okay, this is about the, if I remember correctly, how one can come up, or what I would say, so far we categorize one level to a long piece of music. When music is a dynamic stimuli, and we know emotion is a non-stationary process. So it is very important to have a temporal structure of the emotions and to relate the musical dynamics with the fluctuations of the emotions experienced by the listener consciously or unconsciously, which can be measured by brain and other neurophysiological measurements. So there are some other. I think that's it.
I can find the slide for you.
That's all right. That's all right.
I'd like to apologise to the missing slide, which was a
Okay.
PowerPoint. Thank you very much. We'll miss out on the applause until later, if that's okay, because we want to crack on. Our next speaker, could you just move this
What do we
forward
do?
one?
I don't know what it is we do. Oh,
Right, there we are. Thank you. Is Tim Crawford, a former colleague of mine, and indeed current colleague of mine, from Goldsmiths, University of London. Tim is their Professor of Computational Musicology, and he is also still chair of ISMIR.
Well, it's called President, but...
President of the ISMIR Society.
Geraint asked me to represent the community of historical musicologists. Now, I suppose that's what I am fundamentally, but I began life as a performer, so I'm slightly not a professional historical musicologist any more than I'm a professional music IR expert. So I have to say that I'm standing in for a community of people who some of whom are present, but I'm not fully part of that community. But what I can say is that I believe one of the main aims of professional musicologists is to place music in its historical and its cultural context. And that's music of any period. That just because it's called historical doesn't mean it's always music of the past. It could be music of the present. The same issues arise, that there is still a context for music which is going on now. And historical musicologists, like any historian, base their work on the interpretation of evidence, largely through study of documents. And these documents are mostly, of course, scores in various forms. They have different kinds of notation and different formats. Of course, in the digital world, we have PDF files and all those kinds of things. But of course, also, increasingly, audio is being used or being considered as part of the material that provides evidence for musicologists. And audio, of course, raises the whole question of performance and the relationship of performers to the music that they're performing, as Joy mentioned earlier. Traditionally, the discipline of historical musicology hasn't been very much concerned with music as it's performed, but this is in fact changing quite radically as we speak. Musicologists, like everyone else, require data in the form of managed corpora of, in this case, for computational work, of digital materials. In other words, they need access to digital libraries, which raises whole questions about corpus building. How do you build a corpus of historical music in a digital form? It wasn't born digital. It has to be converted into a digital format. So one typical area where that has to be tackled is, which tackles this, is optical music recognition, which is a very complex sub-discipline of its own in the MIR community. Well, whether it's part of MIR or not, I'm not sure, but it's certainly a difficult task, and it's one that contributes to my own research quite significantly. And of course, historical musicologists need to access the actual musical content, what we call the dots. And that process, I think, is what generally we think of as music information retrieval. And of course, they ideally need to do this through interfaces that they recognize and understand. Not by command line queries and so on. I'll come on to that a little bit later on. The final thing I want to mention that I think is part of what historical musicologists do, they do an awful lot more than this, of course, but they need to be able to present the results of their content-based investigations in a way that will convince their peers. And that's fairly obvious. Now, in other words, they need to be able to draw conclusions from this evidence, which are in the form of an argument or a discourse that will convince a very, well, in one sense sympathetic, but in another sense possibly hostile audience of their peers. Okay, musicologists always inevitably aspire to perfect retrieval results. They always want to see every instance of this particular query, and they want to see it, they don't want anything to be missed, they want perfect precision, and they want very low recall and all the rest of it. But they will not expect this from computers, because they know that computers can't do the job that they do. However, it has to be said that imperfect tools are better than none, and at present it is generally true that historical musicologists have almost no tools with which they can do this kind of thing. Now, I started in this field about 15 years ago because I felt that I wanted tools to help me with my work. And quite honestly, I'm still waiting for those tools to come along. So, there's a challenge there, actually, to produce tools which are usable by people who aren't very expert technically. There exist very few complete MIR systems that could be used for musicology. There are a few exceptions to that. It is possible to build systems, as we all know, from existing components, but this really is beyond the capabilities of all but a very few musicologists who have that particular aptitude. And in fact, I think this is and I've been observing the ISMIR conferences for the whole decade and more of their existence. It is true that very little MIR research really takes into account consideration of end users. And by end users, I mean the man in the street who might want to use these things. At least end users who are not highly competent technically. So that's basically the same challenge I mentioned earlier. The MIR effort of this past decade, as represented by ISMIR, began partly as a result of demand from musicologists and music librarians. Obviously, there was another parallel discipline in audio research on music, but it was fairly small, I think, and very specialized in a few research groups when the ISMIR program, a series of conferences began. And the audio field has expanded enormously, but because there's a kind of industry-driven application of MIR because of the internet era. I don't need to tell anybody here about that. But the applications that emerge from that are almost wholly unsuitable for musicology, except in the rather limited sense that they are useful for everyone. So recovering a certain piece of music from a large digital collection is made easier by those tools, and in that sense, it's good for musicology, but it doesn't do anything specifically musicological for those for the specialist users. And one of the reasons for this is that these industry-driven applications, which are, after all, concerned with aiding or encouraging online purchase and download of music tracks, they're essentially performing what in the IR world is called document-level retrieval. And as it happens, in most cases, it's recognized that this is best done using textual metadata that allows people to search using concepts such as genre, or perhaps one day mood or emotion. I mean, the genre, you will be able to say quite soon that you want a piece of country music that is sad, the point is, all this work on mood and emotion is to come up with labels that can be used in a retrieval system that is essentially a text retrieval system in the end. You're just using labels. There's nothing essentially musical about the search process at that point, once you've done the initial processing and labeling. Now, I'm being a little bit unfair here, but I want to bang this point that it's just been mentioned, and I've actually heard it mentioned a few times during this week, though I wasn't at yesterday's. But I was here at the sound software workshop on Monday, which actually isn't part of this conference, but it was closely related to it. And it would be a bit unfair to say that people don't take account of this, but music is a dynamic process. It happens in time, and things happen during pieces of music. There are events in pieces of music, and musicologists need to look inside pieces of music in order to find interesting points of change within the music. An MIR system that simply returns a ranked list of tracks is not enough for this, and that's really the basic reason why the retrieval tools aren't very helpful for musicologists. Musicology needs tools that can carry out passage-level retrieval, as the IR phrase has it. In other words, discovering locations of matches within documents, not just a list of likely documents. This creates challenges for query formulation. It creates challenges for searching and matching algorithms because they, in a large system, a large database, this requires a completely different attitude to indexing methods. which are essential when you have 1 million tracks or something like that. And also in the presentation of results and their interpretation. And hardly any research actually has been done on passage level MIR in audio. Possibly, I mean, in the sense of evaluating how well it's gone on, it's been done. Possibly this is because of that very difficulty. It is actually quite difficult to evaluate that. I mean, how do we know that this particular match within a 10 minutes of music is better than another one? Actually, I think I might as well stop there, because I was going to say something about evaluation, and I think I've probably said enough.
Okay, that's the end of the 10 minutes. Thank you, Tim. Our next speaker is Alan Marsden, who, well, it's always a particular pleasure to introduce Alan at an event like this, because Alan is the reason that I got into this field in the first place. He organised a conference in 1987 that I attended in Lancaster, and that's what made me realise that you could study computers and music together. He still works at Lancaster, having been away and come back, in the music department, where he works on computational musicology. Over to you, Alan.
Thank you. One small correction, actually, it's not the music department anymore.
Oh.
We're now called the Lancaster Institute for the Contemporary Arts.
I do beg your pardon.
Yes, I have to say that. I'm going to be, well, doing what it says on the slide to try and provoke some thoughts rather than talking about my work much. So here goes. In The Guardian, a few weeks ago, there was one of the pass notes things on the topic of Dark Side of the Moon, which apparently David Cameron at the time was stating was his favourite album on his Facebook page. Now this was in The Guardian as regarded as worthy of comment because apparently before the election he had said that his favourite album was in fact the Smiths' The Queen is Dead. And on other occasions he has named Florence and the Machine and REM and apparently others. So the inference of the item, tongue-in-cheek item in The Guardian is that either David Cameron doesn't know what he likes in music or he's not telling us the truth. Now, I'm interested in why this was in The Guardian at all, why it's become a topic of discussion, and the reason is because it demonstrates that we think music is important. It's something we care about. And even to the extent that we think it tells us something about whether this man is suitable to be leader of our country. Curious that we should pay attention to something like this to perhaps the same degree to which we pay attention to whether someone's being truthful about their tastes in music, the degree to which they're applying the same kind of criteria of truth about whether there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, perhaps. But there we are. Music appears to be important to this degree. As I say, something we actually care about. So we are often emotional about music. And I think we need to ask ourselves, is that the same as recognizing emotions in music? Almost certainly not. Do we ever make the mistake of confusing the two? Being emotional about music and finding emotion in music. If we care about music so much, why don't we treat it as if with cotton gloves, like other items that we regard as precious, and we treat them very, very carefully? And you see the classic thing on television that somebody, whenever a rare book comes out, somebody puts on white gloves, handle it, or an artwork, whatever. But we tend not to do that with music. I think we're actually very cavalier in the way we treat music in our research, especially. We hear versions of it that are reconstructed from MFCCs that sound bizarre. Is it because we believe that music doesn't break if we drop it? I mean, essentially that we are not at risk of harming the music by our actions, through our research. And I want to suggest that in general, perhaps, but absolutely not. 100%, that it is not true that we do not have an effect on the music that we research by doing our research. It's easy to point to some examples of how music has been fundamentally changed by application, by the influence of technology. Prime one is the innocent little tune that appeared in a piece called Grand Valse by a composer, I forgot his name, Torregas, which was taken up by Nokia for their ringtone, and so now whenever that piece of music is heard almost anywhere in the world, out pops them, and all the audience are very surprised to hear there's the Nokia ringtone in the middle of this piece of music. The piece of music has been changed as a result of the influence of Nokia's use of it in their technology. Here's another example, I believe, of a piece of music which I think is at risk of being changed by overuse. Now that's, you hear very frequently on television. It's used as a clip for all sorts of, accompanying all sorts of images. Often the kind of images you see on the screen, but in fact only one of those is very precisely the image originally associated with that extract of music, which is from the early part of Benjamin Britten's opera Peter Grimes, and it's a portrayal of dawn on the Sussex coast. Sorry, Suffolk. I'm glad to have a musicologist to correct me. And now, this isn't a case of MIR or music research changing the music, but I think the potential is certainly there that we could have a considerable impact. So what will music be like if we get to the stage when most of the time music is selected on the basis of, from a list of things retrieved on the basis of mood, for example. So we don't think, I fancy listening to Charles Mingus. You think, oh, I fancy listening to something that's, I don't know, whatever mood we fancy, something that's soporific. Okay? And we actually choose the music on that basis instead of on the basis of the artist or whatever. And that, I think, would fundamentally change our musical culture, just as I think it has been fundamentally changed already by the invention of compression algorithms, which enable us to carry all our music around with us in a tiny little device, which means now the principal way in which we hear music is as a private experience associated with travel, which is absolutely not the way in which music was heard principally 50 years ago, even less than that perhaps. So I ask, what is CMMR research doing to musical culture? And I think this is a question which we as researchers, you, each individually as researchers, should be asking yourselves about your research. What are the likely consequences? Are those consequences ones that you would like to see in music? And do remember that the consequences that come about are not necessarily the ones that you intend. So, since this panel is about the future of research, I want to suggest two possible projects as examples of the kinds of things where I believe would be indicative of treating music with that kind of care, which is as if we were treating it with, handling it with cotton gloves. So how about a search engine for pleasant surprises? So instead of a search engine that finds music similar to some other music, or music that's in a particular mood or whatever, let's have something which explicitly finds things which are surprising, different from what we've heard before, but ones which we will find pleasant. And we could test this. I can see a paradigm for doing this. Let's have a Myrex competition where the idea is that the software generates a playlist for an internet radio station which is accessible during the conference, and the winner of the competition is the one that gets listened to most by the participants from the conference. Here's a second suggestion, a sound file player which actually respects the music that it's playing, and so when you pause the music and restart it, instead of just restarting where you stopped, it goes back to the beginning of the phrase. If you're conversing with a friend and your conversation gets interrupted, your friend doesn't resume in mid-sentence where he was to go back to the beginning of the sentence. And the same with pieces of music. In my opinion, that's what a sound file player ought to actually do, is to respect the structure of the music and go back to a suitable point to restart. So there we are. There's a couple of suggestions for things that I think could be desirable in the future of CMMR. I want to avoid explicitly now suggesting things which I regard as undesirable, but I'm sure there are many. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. So our final speaker of our four is Professor John Sloboda, Professor Emeritus at Keele. Is that right? Yes, Professor Emeritus at Keele University, and also a Professor at the Guildhall School of Music. John is, I think, quite reasonably thought of by many people as the beginner of the field of music psychology. His book in 1985 was certainly one of the major factors in the establishment of that field in modern times, and it's a very great pleasure to have him here. And over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Geraint. Like some of my colleagues, I took Geraint's invitation as one to offer some challenges to the music information, retrieval and research communities. And that's quite a tall order for someone who doesn't know actually a great deal about the current state of your discipline, so I feel rather humble and rather privileged. Also, some of the points I'm going to be raising are similar to points that have been raised down the table already, and that's in some sense reassuring, and it's one of the consequences of being last. So I'm going to talk about two challenges that I possibly could offer you for the discipline to think about. First is expanding the musical object, and the second one is addressing human benefit, and I'll deal with those in turn. So there's been an important trend in musicology over the last few decades, which has already been alluded to, and to some extent there's been a kind of interplay between what's been going on in psychology. Attention was placed very much on the score, the text, in a past time, and more it has moved towards what I call the sound file, or the audio stimulus. And this is something which certainly has taken effect in mainstream music psychology, cognitive psychology, perceptual psychology, although I have contributed a little bit of research on the perception of the visual score. The vast majority of research in music psychology has been on the sound file or its predecessor. And it seems to me from the sample of papers that I've heard here and read the programme in advance that that is the case also for your own discipline. And this is an improvement because it encompasses more of the full phenomenon, but there is even there still a danger. It can lead to, just as in earlier generations of musicology, somehow the score got essentialized, I think there's an equal danger of the sound file becoming essentialized. And psychologists and social scientists of music have pointed out that the sound is merely one component, albeit a very important one, of the entire musical object. And that entire musical object might be better described as the performance in context. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, all music, without any exception, was created in a live performance setting. Unless, of course, it's machine-generated. I'm talking about human-generated music. In a specific place, at a specific time, with specific people present or involved, some of them planning it, some of them performing it, some of them listening to it, some of them curating the event, some providing various kinds of technical or professional assistance, such as recording it, and all brought together in that time and place for specific social purposes, For example, it might be a lesson, it might be a wedding, it might be a broadcast, it might be a rehearsal, it might be a concert, and so on, and so on, and so on. In addition, each person brings to that setting a set of prior beliefs, understandings, attitudes towards the music, and towards the setting, and towards the performers, as well as their own current mental state, that is, the emotions and the preoccupations they bring into the room. And all these components are a part, I would contend, of the inclusive musical object. And the responses you'll have, and the judgments you will make, and the emotions that you will feel towards or detect in the musical object can be, and possibly are, determined by all of these things. Some directly, but not necessarily directly, some of them as a result of your awareness or interpretation of them. For instance, listening to a performance which you know to be live and might be being listened to by thousands of other people simultaneously, both in a venue that you might be inhabiting, but also all over the world, as for example might happen in a major concert broadcast by the BBC on proms or whatever, that will generate different emotions to one which is of a past event. And people talk of liveness as an important quality of musical performance. And part of this may be detectable in the sound file, in terms of aspects of a sound file which make it sound more live somehow. Some of the liveness may only be mediated through the cues you receive that this particular performance is actually being generated now at this moment. And by definition, the sound file can't really carry that information. And we'll all have, I hope, an opportunity to observe and review some of the elements of liveness in the post-dinner performances tonight. In that case, your responses will be likely influenced by what you've been told in advance about what's going to happen, the works to be performed, the people who are going to perform them, and, critically, how others are responding to it. Not only orally, but with their breathing, their movement, their applause maybe, the way the players and the audience are arranged in the room, who can see what, who can see who, what the visual interplay between the performers is, and so on and so on. So the question I have for you is, can all these elements be inserted into the computational or music information retrieval analysis of music? And in a helpful preparatory email to panel participants, Geraint characterized music information retrieval as finding the music you want. And I was very grateful for that very simple and straightforward definition of what could otherwise seem a rather obscure and complex task. But if Geraint is right, then is music information retrieval able to help people like me who are mainly interested in locating suitable live performances to attend, rather than suitable files to download? Or is it the case that your discipline can only ever operate on the sound files of past recorded performances? And does this place a permanent limitation on the utility of your field? So I'll just leave that hanging and move to my second challenge, which is the one of addressing human benefit. So the above idea, which I floated, is just one kite that one person, me, has floated. My colleagues along the table have floated some other kites. But what are the criteria that a research community can or should use to determine where to put costly research effort? And I contend that one criterion could be social benefit. Why? Well, given the limited resources available and the many needs the world has, we have a responsibility not to waste resources. And research is very resource heavy, not least on individuals' time. One could argue that our research therefore should contribute to well-being, social welfare, or social justice in some way. And I don't think I can be particularly challenged if I say that my impression is that many researchers, because I include myself in this, have a rather lazy attitude towards social benefit. There's an implicit false logic in some of the positions I've seen, which runs roughly like this when people are challenged on it. Music is of social benefit, my research is on music, therefore my research is on social benefit. And I think it wouldn't take more than 30 seconds for a first-year logic student to demolish that one. But it does seem actually to be what underlies a lot of the vague excuses or points in the direction of social benefit that some researchers put out there when challenged. I think we need a more stringent and valid test. Now, companies and other organisations increasingly are developing corporate social responsibility policies and plans. And my question is it time for the community of scholarly interest to do likewise? So, could this conference, for example, have a social responsibility policy? And if so, how would it be generated? Drawing on what resources and building on what models? And it's kind of shocking, actually, that we have so few models to draw on, that academics have worked to build. This is not something on most academics' radar. So I have one wild idea for your organising committee. In your next call for papers, announce that social benefit will be an additional criterion used to assess proposals, and that some specified percentage of the papers that are accepted for the conference will need to score highly on this dimension. And I think a subcommittee will have fun and profit discussing and agreeing what those criteria might be. And if those conversations are productive, you may well be able to have influence way outside your own narrow field. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much. That was a very varied and interesting selection of thoughts. We're running a little bit behind time, so we'll maybe shorten our cross-examining period slightly. But first of all, I'm going to give the speakers the opportunity to challenge each other or question each other further on their expressed thoughts so far. If they have nothing to ask, we'll go straight to the rest of the room. I feel silly calling this the floor because it goes up there. Gentlemen. Who would like to start?
Okay. John, very interesting actually, observation or suggestions. How do you measure social benefit, or also how do you factorize? Because there are some actions which have immediate benefits, and some actions or some research or whatever it is, which you may not see the benefit immediately, but in the long run, okay, you see that the benefit out of the research outweigh the immediate benefit. So are you aware of any kind of standard measure, there where you can have a sufficiently partial out this kind of time discounting? Because many of if you take the aspect of theoretical physics, there at least music here we can come with a lame argument, but if you consider theoretical physics, then there is apparently no immediate benefit. But we know most of the technological innovations that we enjoy, take it as granted, they're primarily driven by the research done by theoretical physicists, which people are not aware of the benefit and outcome at that moment, but over the years, then when it converted to the technology, then it has benefited the overall society. So now the question is how, or if you have any suggestions to measure this kind of immediate impact. I know the funding body also these days, they somehow emphasize that every research funding should have somehow some contribution or some impact on the society. So now the question is, do we have a kind of yardstick to measure the impact of social well-being and how we can somehow compensate those research ideas or projects, whether it is, because it's a general, whether it is a kind of music information research or any other research where benefit is not immediately seen, but in the potential you cannot rule out, because if you can rule out, then it's not a logic anymore, because infinitely you cannot say it has no benefit, because that would be a dogmatic stance. So if you have any suggestion, it would be brilliant to hear.
I would have to say that I have not kind of undertaken, either by myself or with colleagues, the exercise which I'm inviting your committee to do. And so the decisions I've taken about my own, what I choose to do, are kind of based on idiosyncratic and changing perspectives. And I absolutely agree with you that I don't think it makes for good science if social benefit is the only criterion on which scientific activity is chosen. I think there is a huge place for following an idea because A, it's possible to do, there's a possible next step, also curiosity, etc., etc. I'm only suggesting that social benefit should be in the mix.
So you're proposing kind of a weighted model of where social benefit also a parameter which would be weighted. Okay.
A weighted component. But the other thing is also to ask the question, there are already stakeholders. I mean, you don't get to do research unless someone funds you to do it. And they fund you to do it, presumably, because they want something from that research that you do. So there is no sense in which any research that's going on doesn't already have stakeholders who want something. So it's simply a question of analysing what they want and asking the question, well, should I align my research with someone who wants something which I think is rather dodgy and rather suspect, or should I try and align my research more with someone who seems to want something which would be of more wide benefit? It may not be a full answer to your question, but it's along those kinds of lines that I would begin to work.
Pick up relating a little to John's comment about stakeholders, and Tim was talking about MIR's needs to be engaging with the man in the street, or woman in the street, I'm sure, also. I suspect actually that MIR research is already having some impact through websites like Glass.fm. But I want to follow a slightly different tack, which is I think there's a real danger of MIR research being misunderstood and actually potentially dangerously misunderstood in the same way that research, a small piece of research, was dangerously misunderstood and became the whole phenomenon of the so-called Mozart effect. Which actually did have negative social consequences. Money was being wasted in American states in sending CDs to households with newborn children in the hope that it would make them more intelligent. So I think it's something that we do need to be concerned about, is that to be confident or to take steps to try and ensure that our research is not misunderstood. And I'm wondering if Tim has ideas about how that could be, how we could guard against that danger.
Gosh, that's a big question, isn't it? No, frankly, I don't. Going back to, if I may, just go back to the point about the man in the street. I didn't mean that that MIR research is not impacting on the man in the street. That's not at all what I meant. What I meant was there is no MIR tool that the man in the street can use, as it were, to get. They will benefit indirectly from the results of it. It may not be a useful thing. I mean, but I'm sure there are elephants in the room, aren't there? There's Google. I mean, obviously, we've seen, we've had a talk today from people working on exactly this from Google, and it's quite clear that sometime there's going to be something like a Google for music, meaning something that will enable you to find the piece of music you want by using a piece of music as a query. That seems fairly clear from the nature of that paper. And that's the kind of tool I mean. But all I was saying is for a musicologist, that won't be sufficient. Just as with Google, you may find the document that interests you, but you've got to find, if you want to find a particular phrase in that document, you have to use the secondary find. You have to use your web browser's internal find mechanism to find out. This is probably, this audience has no difficulty with that concept, but that's a little bit more challenging for the average user, I would say. Sorry, I don't know whether I've gone way off your point, and I apologise for that. I was just evading answering your question, if you like.
Yeah, can I just make a comment on a very interesting point you have made, that why if music we consider it so precious, why we don't treat it with a cotton club? I'm not sure about the historically whether there are any other precedents there. Okay, whether in earlier times whether we are allowed to tinker with the music, but at least till recent times, I know because I'm from India. There is the Indian, I was the first Asian Nobel laureate, the Tagore. Okay, he wrote enormous body of music, and when he died, okay, in 1948, there was a strict rule imposed by the government, which was for 60 years it lasted. Nobody is allowed to change any note on the Tagore songs and to release any cassettes or CDs. So that's one example. I think it shows that, yeah, it can be considering the social or cultural prestige or the norm. Sometimes music is used as a kind of, with a cotton glove, people are not allowed to tinker. And if you go now, because after 60 years that imposition is over, now people can sing in whatever the way they want, okay, there. So I think you have to also bring the kind of society, the culture perspective. In some cases, yes, we did treat, and I'm pretty sure if you go back to the history, you will find this is not an isolated incident. Suppose I can give another very example there again in Indian context. The famous Indian scriptures, the Vedas, because they didn't have any written systems. Everything was memorized in melody, and they were strictly, they have to memorize in exact notes. They were not allowed, across the generations, they're not allowed to change anything. So in that cases, I would not consider, I mean, now, yes, we are allowed to change, we can do because of I would say, in terms of thinking, the globalization, we are becoming more global. But if you go back, if you look into the history, I think, okay, music, I would say to some extent shares with other precious materials the way we deal with them. Okay, we dealt with any precious gem with the cotton gloves. To some extent, we dealt also music, okay, like it is a kind of very precious or even a very sacred material, so we are not allowed to change. So you have to also incorporate the cultural context. Now we are allowed to change, okay, but historically I do not think that was the same throughout the history.
Maybe this is something to do with the commoditization of music that you were referring to. Were those questions coming up there?
Yeah, I was just going to say that there was an example given of exactly the opposite phenomenon, what's happening nowadays. Barber's Adagio, it's a famous piece of music which for most people now is associated with 9/11. Now, I knew that piece long before 9/11, of course, and it's a very emotional piece of music, but now it has this very specific meaning because it was used obsessively by TV companies to accompany the events of 9/11 and afterwards, when they showed films of it. So that piece is a perfect example of a piece that's taken on a completely new context, which has nothing to do with the original context of the piece, which is actually part of a string quartet, and it's better known in a version for string orchestra. There are also versions for vocal ensemble, and so on. So these things are extremely complex. So one could say that the vast majority of people know it, with this important historical association. But then there are all these other people. Some people will know it as a tune as something they sang in church, because that's the way it's a piece of choral music. Some people will know it as a string quartet. All these individual contexts are all part of what was being talked about in terms of this is incredibly complex. And actually, I would say that that's the sort of thing that historical musicologists are interested in, but actually it interests us all.
Sorry. Well, that sounds like a lovely lead-in to opening this discussion for the floor. Whoa, that was key. Right. So I'm going to be quite strict about chairing here, so please don't just pipe up, and colleagues should wait until I point to people. So we've got one question there. There was another question from Steve up at the back, another one from Roger. Okay, so we'll start. I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Alexis Kirk.
absolutely brilliant, really stimulating. And that's why I've been on the edge of my seat wanting to ask this question. This thing, you know, CMMR, it's clear from what I've been hearing, CMMR is going to have an effect on the way music is produced, particularly the mass producing of pop music, production music. You know, Google has affected the HTML content of web pages. Radio players affected the way that pop music is produced. CMMR, if there end up being 3 dominant selection systems, you know, spammers currently will take the anti-spam systems and they'll run all their stuff through the anti-spam systems to try and optimize so that they can get past them. If I was running a record company or I was running a production music organisation, I would take my music and I would try and make sure it hit the centre of the emotion categories through tweaking the production values that I was doing. So does the panel think that successful CMMR could actually end up homogenising production values of music, particularly mass market music, into a bunch of small categories?
Okay. Before you answer that, please keep it brief, because this one could run and run. Who wants to go first?
Yes.
I second that.
Is this a good thing or a bad thing, in your opinion?
Oh, look, we're too old to give it a sensible...
John, you want to
Yes, and it allows me to actually say the thing that Geraint referred to. I came a few hours early because I just wanted to sample a bit of what was going on at this conference. And I heard some very detailed technical papers on how best to assign to music tracks labels such as happy, sad, etc. And I suppose my question really is that how people who use music want to be able to select music? Now, there is actually some psychological research on this, and it's based on, for example, how people organise their collections. And you interview studies of, well, what they want a piece of music for. And it's quite rare, actually, what they want a piece of music for is because it's sad or because it's happy. They want it to work to, or to drive to work in the morning to, or they want it to last 3.5 minutes because there's a whole set of reasons. If you look at how people organise their collections, they don't organise them very often by mood category. So I think the first thing is to find out what people want, and maybe social benefit is actually about tailoring the music information retrieval systems to deliver what it is that users want. But even if people do want emotional categories, I'm not, perhaps I just don't know enough about your discipline. I was hearing 60%, 70% correct. Wouldn't it be simpler just to have a panel of listeners rate all these pieces on emotional dimensions, and then those ratings would be the way that people would choose their music, and I would quite frankly trust 100 listeners more than I trust a programme. Maybe I'm just being very naive.
It's a question that can be asked, I think. Thank you. Any other one?
I mean, I can just, similar to John said, the emotion category, okay, I mean, as I just briefly mentioned, there is no accepted model of emotions. How many emotional categories you want to choose? Do you use a 500, open-ended? Do you use, only 2, happy and sad? And these are all somehow, give a very fragmented picture. And on the top of it, very importantly, the same music can be categorized, even completely differently by the same individual. So I do not know how, how much, we'll gain definitely to some extent give a level by that, but possibly we'll get a better understanding why, music, say, creates so much of variability, and also I would think that possibly for me it is more interesting on what ground, so suppose same piece of music creates different emotions, or how it regulates emotion. And another one, I personally never give one emotion category to one piece of music which is suppose 5 minutes long, because we get a lot of different complex kind of spectrum of emotions. So it is, I know that we like to compress the information, but I wonder, by this compression of information, just giving a one tag to a one long piece of complex piece of or sound stimuli, we are losing the picture.
Thank you. So I think that's answered. Steve?
Yeah, it's true that a lot of MIR papers, they'll start something along the lines of, there's a hell of a lot of digital music around these days out there, and therefore we need new ways of searching for it. But me personally, historically, but even still now, I discover music through human forms. So it's either a radio show that I respect, or peers, or and I don't really want that to change, actually. I don't really want machines to be recommending music for me. So, for me, MIR is more of it's a philosophical thing. The question is, why do I like music at all? What do I like or dislike about particular pieces of music? And MIR is a possible way to advance that field in a philosophical sense. So is MIR more than a branch of philosophy rather than engineering?
So this is the difference between music information retrieval and music information research. Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. Any comments?
I don't disagree. I think that's a very interesting way of looking at it. Though whether it'll ever be a branch of philosophy as such, I'm not quite sure.
But I guess most papers are like that because we have to have this simple impact, don't we? So it's about a commercial justification for why we do this.
I mean, it's no secret amongst, I think, senior people in the field that there's a lot of wishful thinking about a lot of money being earned by MIR researchers. We could start a whole thing about the career path here. People's motivations for doing research vary, I think one has to say.
There is place for a discussion about career paths when we're talking about the future of this field, actually. It's very relevant. Someone who's finishing his PhD should ask that question. Alan, did you want to add something?
Yes, this is answering your question in an indirect fashion, because I'm not really going to answer it about MIR, but about music analysis. Because before I got into as Geraint mentioned, I've been doing computational related research for a long time, but my original motivation was coming from the field of music analysis, and I used to be asked the kind of question that John referred to, which is, what's the use of music analysis? And my answer always was, and still is, that when done well, it helps us to appreciate the music more. And I suspect, I hope that actually there is a role for this kind of research such as we have at this conference, as you're suggesting, that actually by understanding or being able to see how music might operate in a way differently from the one that we had suspected or we had experienced ourselves, our experience of music actually is enriched. And to me that would be the greatest social benefits from this kind of research, is we actually lead to enriched music experiences.
And of course, the word appreciate has a double meaning. And one of those meanings is you enjoy the music more if you know how it works. Or a certain type of person enjoys the music more if they understand it's working. I don't suppose that works across the board, but
maybe we can help it work across the board.
Yes. Just a small comment. The one is more comment, and another is more of a question over to your point that if you do music analysis, then it helps to enjoy the music more. So a couple of years back, when we did some research on music and emotion, tried to characterize how emotions are elicited in the music, then there was a tongue-in-cheek article published in Guardian on our research. The title was "Keep Boffin Out of Music." So I don't know. Okay, I mean just comment. And the second is on your assumptions, or that's kind of the essence of you say that why. Okay, what is the purpose of music analysis? To help to have a better to have a better experience or enrich the quality of experience. Now the question is it always the case? So does that mean those who have no knowledge of music analysis, do they get less pleasure or quality of pleasure, or they are not as enriched, their emotional experience are not as rich as the persons, those who knows the music analysis through and through? So do you think that's the case? I understand, your point, but I'm just proposing a question that, okay, should we assume on that basis that in order to fully appreciate the music, to have a very rich experience, do you really need to analyze the music in the way a professional musicologist does, or what do you think?
No, we don't need to. Though interestingly, that is something which could be tested empirically. We could see, do those who have musical training have richer musical experiences? I could imagine an experiment which tracks the various methods for continuous tracking of emotion. Do those with musical training give a kind of more patterned or richer variation of emotional response, perhaps? But I do strongly believe that you do not require any kind of musical training or to appreciate music. But I suspect that you have more diverse experience. That's one of the benefits of musical training, is that it does give you the openness to more diverse experiences in music. So richer in that sense.
I just wanted to come back, in a sense, to something Joy said, and it was a kind of reference to me, that I'd said something in my earlier book about the reason why most people value music because of its emotional power. I think I would probably rail back from that statement now, and not quite regret it, but think that was probably a bit over the top. And I'm actually wondering whether we're privileging emotion a bit too much here, and that might be an example of the kind of way in which science or a certain discourse is actually, in some sense, impoverishing music experience in the kind of way that Alan was talking about. Because I think that quite a lot of the ways in which one could be intensely engaged with music are not strictly emotional in the way that we've been talking about today, but to do with things like absorption, fascination, a deep immersion in the structure and the unfolding over time, which are not necessarily emotions in the way that we normally talk about them. And you might not be feeling any particular one of happy, sad, or anything, just completely engaged with that object. So I think there's a much wider range of ways of engaging with music than emotionally.
I mean, something's popped into my head. The literary genre of the detective novel. Detective novels, it's well known that they all follow the same pattern. They all have exactly the same structure. And kind of knowing that structure does help people in a way to enjoy them more. Now, does that involve emotion when you read that? When you read a detective novel, is that structure revealing itself emotionally to you in terms of emotional response, or is there something else going on? There's something to do with this absorption, the intricacy of it, the engagement with it, which has an emotional component, but you couldn't relate it to happy and sad.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean this is a more fundamental point. Okay, I mean what is emotion there? Okay, I mean if you consider, if I explain in the neurophysiological terms, yeah, I could say, although we purposefully are not saying those, okay, we are not listening to music or engaging, just want to engage, not necessarily want to be happy, but there are quite a strong overlap in terms of the brain responses, like reward circuitry, although we are not explicitly looking for happiness, but we feel, okay, this, whenever, suppose one mentioned that this absorption, we know by the recent neurophysiological studies that when we get fully immersed into some activities, our reward system in the brain, they lights up. Now, we might not say we are very happy, but we get pleasure out of it. And those experiences that I also mentioned, these are not immediately available to consciousness. We do not use the verbal level, we feel happy or we feel sad, but the similar brain responses are also activated. Similar brain regions are activated.
Thank you. We're getting quite close towards the end of the session now, so I'm going to ask if we can speed up a little bit. We have Roger, we have Dan, and then we have, Matthias and Isaac and Frank. Are there any other people who want to get questions in? Right, so I'll call a moratorium after those, but can we try and be as concise as possible down here as well, please? Roger first.
So I wanted to offer a comment and raise a challenge. The comment was that I strongly agree with your proposal, John, of the importance of social benefit. I just think we have to be very careful about how we let it be applied. so that we don't induce grotesque criteria being applied. To give an example that just faced me, for example, a complaint about a grant application that it didn't show how I was going to transform cultural appreciation by a study of Balkan music. We can get to ridiculous levels of demand, which just undoes the grant process if we're not careful. And of course, there's also the economic overtone, the cultural industries overtone, the Stuart Cunningham research group in Australia, for example, very valuable studies, but pointing to a danger we face. The challenge I wanted to mention is one that Geraint and I share from somewhat different perspectives. That it seems to me that the MIR field has a lot more to offer yet to generative processes in music than have been fulfilled. I mean, to my mind, the one main process which is in regular use within music performance is mosaicing sound spotting, that is using algorithmic recognition of sound files or sound frames even as part of an improvising or compositional process. And while we've heard a lot about computer music technology here, which of course is valuably applied, I don't think we've heard much about, nor do I think there is as much as there could be, of the direct application of MIR towards generative processes.
Comments?
I agree completely, and to me that's one of the important things that in ways in which we could resist the commercial pressures in this field, because the pressure is making most people into musical consumers and a very, very small number of musical producers, whereas we have, I think, a lively musical culture when there's a good balance, and MIR can help to make people into interesting, productive musical producers as well.
On the social benefit, I entirely agree with you. The generation of a set of criteria would have to be a conversation between a wide range of stakeholders. I have some hope that it could yield something better than one hopes, because I think the UK community has gone through a very interesting process recently in terms of generating some criteria for impact, which actually more of the academic community have said, actually, that I can see that works, than I think were prepared to believe it could work at the beginning of the exercise. I think the question is, you have to do the exercise.
Thank you. Right, Dan.
Okay, something that hasn't been mentioned yet, it's quite surprising that it hasn't been mentioned, John almost touched on it, dancing. Most musical forms are associated with dancing in some sense, and for a lot of them, it's often what it's for, or what the context is. So this idea of broadening the musical object, it makes a lot of sense. So if there are techniques in MIR that can kind of consider that aspect, so embodiment for the listener. The listener is not just a pair of ears and brain, but is moving around. And Joydeep, you mentioned features specific to musical emotion, and I'd suggest that is maybe not emotion, but it's certainly specific to music as opposed to a lot of other artistic practices. And there's a slight irony in the idea of trapping people inside fMRI machines to analyse their musical response.
So I'll just give very quick responses. The first one is very interesting, okay, and also very important, that the music and dancing, okay, they're often quite interrelated traditionally, but in the modern research they're somehow separately analysed. In the neuroimaging literature, the recent evidence is that they listen to the pleasant music which activates some of the circuitry which controls our movement there. So they call it the mirror neuron circuitry. So this is, you mentioned, that's just your term used, embodied, okay, there. So as if the music involves, okay, our tapping the circuitry that we use for action or also movement control. Another one very interesting piece of evidence came out recently, that when you listen to the music that you really prefer, that activates the nucleus accumbens. I'm sorry for throwing up these very anatomical terms there. So which is a brain region, it's very deep in the brain, and that projects to another brain region called basal ganglia, and that controls our movement when we dance, there, our motion. So it is an interesting hypothesis that, how the music and the dancing are coupled or at all, or in whether this kind of deeper brain regions which are controlling somehow our motion or the movement, although in the fMRI or in other scanner there is no explicit movement, and that's somehow to some extent answers to your later point that I would not consider this an irony. This is actually a beautiful way to observe. So just as I mentioned, where the participants are not moving, but we can see the brain regions which control the movement, they light up. Means that shows that the music and the motion, they are more intricately coupled. And unless we observe the brains, we won't be able to reveal this kind of hidden relationship. So I do not consider it as an irony. I consider it as a kind of privilege to also to discover, to see what's going on in our brain when we listen to all different types of music.
Thank you, Joy. Any other responses? I'm just going to cheekily share an anecdote with you. I was at a conference with Roger Dannenberg about a week ago, and Roger, as many people will know, is a very accomplished trumpeter, and he'd just been playing trumpet for us. He sat down and started listening to the next talk. He was making notes about the next talk, which I could clearly see on the desk in front of him. With his other hand, he was still playing the trumpet, and his foot was still tapping. And I asked him afterwards what he was doing, and he didn't know that he was doing it. It's rather interesting. So even when there isn't a stimulus, it's going on. Yeah? It's completely unconscious. Right, in the order that I saw the people with their hands up, Matthias.
Yeah, this is on why, sort of on the reasons why we should do our research, whether music information retrieval or music analysis in general. So Alan said that, okay, of course there's the service to industry, and then there's the sort of service to the listener. And I don't know if I just missed it, but isn't it also just the service to the general public who just want to know stuff? So about how humans behave, and I think because music is so central to humans, every time we're doing music analysis, we also find out something about the human who perceives it or thinks it or whatever happens. So that's sort of a bit of pure science, just finding out about the relationship between music and people. Is that also a great I don't know, cause?
Yes.
Yes, Joe.
I think we all agree with that, yes. But was the tapping over here agreement or disagreement?
Total agreement.
Total agreement.
I feel as if I built weapons of mass destruction after. I have never seen my research from that perspective, so thank you for this new site.
Thank you. Okay, so no one wants to make any longer comments about that aspect, but I think we all agree with you, Matthias, absolutely, yes. Frank?
Good point.
Well, I might just follow up before I make my statement. I know I need to be brief, but yes, we inform ourselves about what it is to be human and how we operate in this world, so long as the humans are in the equation. And from what I've observed with this conference, they're not always in the equation in the MIR research, just a comment. So another comment is that there was a question about whether music training might inform our emotional response to music. And this is unfortunately maybe interpreted as a bit of self-promotion, but we've explored this subject recently, and we found that musical absorption, something that was talked about by John, is a better predictor of the polarization of emotional response to music than is musical training. So the polarization of emotional response has been measured through physiological responses and subjective evaluations. So you can think of the variability that one will have in response to a sad versus happy piece of music will be greater when one's sense of absorption is greater. It doesn't seem to reflect musical training from what we've observed.
Thank you. Anyone wish to respond?
So I just comment, or I would second to your first point that it's very important to include the human into the equation. And that doesn't mean that we can just ask, oh, what do that you think, happy or sad? That is not enough weight in the equation. You have to, you get a better understanding if you get more data from the listeners, or also incorporate the context, or possibly. So just I was thinking this, you gave an example of David Cameron, although it was used in different contexts, but it is an interesting observation that our preference, we have a lot of favorite piece of music. It's not like that if I ask you, even if you truthfully answer, it's not you always give the same answer. So that begs, why is it so? Okay, so if you include, because one of your aims is to find the music that you want, so means in order to answer sufficiently, it is important that the system should know you, means who is the listener, who is seeking for, so to have more information about the listener in order to get a better, more appropriate answers. And in simple terms, since this relationship is not stationary, so you have to, because you change, means the listener changes from time to time, the same individual, and this only can be addressed when you incorporate more parameters into your system, including context, intentionality, and so forth.
So there's a challenge if there ever was one. Our last question. Isaac.
So there's been a lot of talk about MIRs benefiting the public, benefiting musicologists, and protecting music itself as an artifact, which I think are all really provocative, important ideas that I'm really happy to have discussed. What I haven't heard anything about, and it's almost, and maybe I missed it, but no one has really talked about MIRs benefiting musicians. And I don't know if anyone's been following some debate that's been happening on the internet in the past few days, partly about copyright, but also about the role of tech companies as the kind of new arbiter of music consumption. And, we're not really sure yet, but there's some evidence that it might be even worse for the artists than the old models. Thinking of things like Spotify and Pandora might be actually worse for the artists. And these are things that are enabled by MIR tools. So I think, this ties in really nicely to the social benefit thing and also the emotional thing, because people often relate to music emotionally through the people involved in creating it. So I wonder if that's a consideration in MIR, or if that's just something that's maybe MIR's not good at, or just not concerned.
There's always been an element of motivation in MIR research connected with, what you might call legal aspects of music, because MIR is obviously a tool which can be used for copyright abuse detection. And there are people here who've done research on this. The whole question of plagiarism in music. These things, now they could in one way be regarded as making life worse for musicians, but I think in other ways they make life better for musicians. I don't think we can dictate a course of action which will avoid any kind of difficulty for any particular element of the musical community. I don't think you can determine these things. I think they've just got to happen. I'm afraid I can see exactly what you're driving at, that there are pluses and minuses. I just think we're just going to have to see what happens.
I wonder if you wanted to mention Econ 3 in this context.
Oh, wow, how?
Well, because it's an answer about musicians. Maybe shall I say something?
Please. I'd love to hear what you say.
This is the project of which Tim is principal investigator.
Oh, I see what you mean, yes.
So there are huge benefits to be had for practicing musicians doing their stuff, which is what I take you to mean. But that's because I know you're an active pianist. So Tim didn't know that. Well, do you want to go on from there? about the community and the loots and so on?
Oh, gosh. Well, I think there is, well, actually, really, it should be Francois Pache or someone like that sitting here talking about that, because actually there was another point raised about creativity. Yes, it was that this technology, if you like, has tremendous potential to allow people who aren't fully trained musicians to engage. Gosh, that sounds so patronising. I don't mean it to be patronising, but I mean it gives new opportunities for people to make music, shall we say, in completely new forms of creative method. I don't want to gush on too much about that, but one of the things that I want to do in a future project is to, given a body of music in score, I would like, let's call them internet musicians. I started to say amateur, then I realised that was dangerous. I don't want to, the pejorative sense of that. I mean people who make music for their own pleasure, to submit their recordings of this music, so that we can do interesting comparisons between what they do and what professional recordings of music do, so that you can maybe find out what it is that is different between a professional performance of a piece of music and an amateur one, in that sense. That's one area. I think there's a lot of interesting work to be done here, which actually will have, I think, quite a lot of benefit. Sorry, that was very badly articulated, but I was rather put on the spot.
Sorry. That's what we're here for.
Yeah, Joy. Just a short note. I mean, as a psychologist, I can see there is a very good potential for I would say, or for possibilities if, suppose, MR communities and psychologists come and work together. I mean, because I can see there's our interest and expertise are complementary, and I think there indeed very promise that if two communities work together in closer cooperation. That's it.
Yeah. That sounds like a very, very good point at which to wind up this session and to go and get something to eat in an hour and a half, I think. Before we leave, I would like very much to thank 4 people and 1 institution. The institution I would like to thank is the EU for funding this, for proposing this panel, and the project Mires, if you say it in Latin, which means wonderful, very appropriate. And then our 4 speakers who worked hard, been put on the spot for an hour and a half, and prepared their talks for us. So thank you very much indeed.